Okay, good afternoon. So today we're going to be looking at Robert Browning's dramatic monologue, My Last Duchess, a poem in which Browning explores the abuse of power within a relationship. The poem tells the story of the Duke of Ferrara, an abusive and controlling and quite suspicious man who suspects his wife of being unfaithful to him, his wife being the last Duchess in the title of the poem. As a result of these suspicions, he decides to have her killed, but her beauty is preserved in a painting, and in this poem, the Duke presents that painting and discusses it with a messenger who has arrived at his house to come and negotiate the terms of his next marriage to his next young bride. So we'll have a quick look through this poem. Once you know the story, once you understand what it's about, it's really quite a simple poem to get to grips with, although the language can be a little bit confusing. It can be a little bit of a barrier at first. But we'll break it down, we'll look at a few of the key lines, annotate it together, and then discuss some of the ideas that Browning is using the poem to convey. So, as I said at the beginning, primarily this poem is an exploration of the abuse of power within a relationship. However, it could also be argued that Browning is using this poem to examine the patriarchal culture of Renaissance Italy. This poem is set during the Renaissance period. Browning himself was passionately interested in history and was a student of history. When I talk about the patriarchal culture, what I'm really discussing there is the idea that it was a culture that was dominated by men and a culture in which women were seen as inferior and expected to be submissive. In this poem, the last Duchess is not submissive. She doesn't simply give in to her husband's expectations. And while it is suggested that she is quite an innocent, almost a naive young woman, Browning does seem to share some sympathy with her, as the punishment she ultimately faces is something that she does not deserve. So let's begin. The first thing to mention is that this poem, as I said, is a dramatic monologue, meaning it's a speech given in from the perspective of a character. And in this context, we know from this italicized word here that this is from the perspective of the Duke of Ferrara, which is an area in Italy. So it's from his perspective, and we open immediately with him speaking to this messenger. And he's introducing the portrait of his last wife. That's My Last Duchess painted on the wall, looking as if she were alive. So we know instantly from that first line that the last Duchess is dead, and we are looking at and examining this portrait of her. The use of the caesura there emphasises that piece of information, emphasises the fact that this wife is now deceased. So the caesura emphasises the fact of her death. And in a poem in which we see quite clearly what this woman was like when she was alive, knowing all the way through that she will die by the poem's end, creates almost a tension from the very outset. So the caesura emphasises the fact of her death. I call that piece a wonder now. Now, a wonder, that word emphasises the Duke's delight in the beauty of this portrait, and we come to understand that he also admired his last Duchess's beauty as well. By the end of the poem, we also understand that he's a lover of art, as indeed the Duke of Ferrara, a real-life historical figure, was known to be. So from that word wonder, immediately, we get the sense that the Duke admires art and loves beauty. So in these opening lines of the poem, Browning is establishing key details about the Duke's persona and what he is like as a character within this poem. I call that piece a wonder now. For Pandolf's hands worked busily a day, and there she stands. So here we understand that this is the artist, the individual who's painted this portrait. And for the first time now, the Duke, this character, speaks to us. And as readers, we are put in the perspective of this messenger. When he says, "Wilt please you sit and look at her?" this line, this question, is addressed to the messenger who's come to his house to negotiate the terms of his next marriage. So we have a question which draws us as readers into this poem and into the world of this poem. And it could be argued that this creates almost a sense of our involvement. We become aware of the Duke's character, we become aware of his suspicions and the slight cruelty in his nature. And as the messenger remains silent, it's almost as though we as readers become complicit. We become almost slightly guilty and involved by association, again creating that slightly tense atmosphere within the world of this poem. As readers, we're drawn in, and this arguably creates that sense of complicity. I said Frau Pandolf by design, for never read strangers like you that pictured countenance, the depth and passion of its earnest glance, but to myself they turned, and seemed as they would ask me if they durst, how such a glance came there. I've just left out this section in parentheses here for a moment. What the Duke is saying here is that the messenger would never have seen the Duchess's face and the way that she looked when she was alive, but others, they, turned to the Duke and seemed to ask if they durst, meaning if they dared, how such a glance came there. So this implies that people were turning to the Duke as if to ask him why the Duchess had a certain expression on her face. And this sense of swirling rumours runs throughout the poem, the sense that the Duke is uneasy about the way that others see his relationship with the Duchess, the way that others view the way that she looks at him. And essentially, he is insecure about whether or not she loves him and is faithful to him. But no one else would ever dare ask him why she looks the way she does. So, the way she looks, she has an earnest glance, which means that she's sincere, the way that she looks, almost as though she isn't trying to hide anything. And that look has a depth, and this is the key word, passion. There is something almost flirtatious, almost as if there is a desire in the way that the Duchess looks. And the way that she looks at others comes to really disturb and unsettle the Duke, as we learn. So, the expression of the Duchess is at once earnest and passionate. Her expression comes to trouble the Duke over time. And we get the first little glimpse here, the first little suggestion that others wouldn't question the Duke. They wouldn't dare to question him. They wouldn't dare to ask such a question. And this creates the impression, in this word, durst, meaning dared, this creates the impression that others are maybe intimidated or threatened perhaps by him, and therefore they wouldn't ask. And that's why they wouldn't question, they wouldn't ask him about his wife. This little section here in brackets, which are also known as parentheses, so that's these. Since none puts by the curtain I have drawn for you, but I, is one of the most revealing lines of the entire poem. This is a man, this Duke, who is so jealous, who is so threatened by the very thought of his wife's unfaithfulness, the very idea that she might not be faithful to him, that even after she is dead, he hides her portrait behind a curtain so that only he can look at it. He has absolute control over who sees her and over who benefits from that ability to look at her beauty. So this reveals to us how possessive he is. And the curtain is a symbol of the Duke's possessive and controlling nature. And when we comment on it as a symbol, this is a method, this is something that Browning intentionally uses to depict and to portray this element of his character's personality. Since none puts by the curtain I have drawn for you, but I. Only he has that power. The fact that this line is in parentheses, is in brackets, makes it sound almost like it's an afterthought for the Duke. He just tosses it off. He just says this as a casual little aside, a frivolous little comment, but actually it reveals so much about him. Since none puts by the curtain I have drawn for you, but I. So, not the first are you to turn and ask thus. So you're not the first person to turn and ask this question. We get the impression that the messenger has asked something or has made a comment on the way that the Duchess looks. The Duke responds, "Sir, 'twas not her husband's presence only called that spot of joy into the Duchess's cheek." These words here, a spot of joy, evoke the idea of a blush, as though she's blushing, she's colouring in her cheeks for some reason. And this could suggest perhaps shyness and embarrassment. But in the Duke's eyes, it's also indicative, it also suggests pleasure or desire or flirtation. He sees her blushing as evidence of her passion. So the fact that it wasn't her husband's presence only, i.e. it wasn't his presence that makes her blush with joy, this angers him. So he expects that only he can make her happy. He should be the only one to bring her joy. And then he speculates, he guesses reasons for her blushing. He imagines what might have happened while the portrait was being painted in order to create this blush in her cheeks. And he imagines a scenario in which the painter is flirting with her. And this feeds his jealousy and it feeds his possessive nature. Perhaps Frau Pandolf, the artist, happened to say, "Her mantle laps over my lady's wrist too much," suggesting that an item of her clothing is covering too much of her arm and that she should perhaps remove it. Or, "Paint must never hope to reproduce the faint half flush that dies along her throat." So these are essentially imagined flirtatious comments that he's suspecting that the painter made towards the last Duchess. Now we need to remember that in this poem, the Duke has the Duchess killed because he believes that she's unfaithful. But here we can start to understand that all of his suspicions are a product of his own paranoia and jealousy. He's imagined this entire situation, this flirtation between the painter and his ex-wife, his last Duchess. And it's causing him to become frustrated because he starts very soon to criticise his last Duchess's personality and criticise the fact that she would blush so easily. Such stuff was courtesy, she thought. So essentially, such comments were polite little gestures, were someone being polite and showing her respect. And cause enough and reason enough for calling up that spot of joy, and enough reason to make her blush. And here comes this first criticism, and it's so revealing of the way that he sees his last Duchess. "She had a heart, how shall I say, too soon made glad." So this is his first criticism of her. And the Duke, in this line, criticises his wife for being too happy, or being too easily pleased. And again, this little comment here, "how shall I say," creates the impression that this is a real person really speaking, really working out their ideas as he goes along. It creates a sense of realism and naturalism within this poem. It's almost like with some of the other poems within the collection, the use of colloquial language helps us to believe in the character, helps us to empathise with them. Here, it's almost as though we're really listening to this conversation between these two people, or as if we indeed are really being spoken to. "She had a heart, how shall I say, too soon made glad, too soon made happy." So in that line, the Duke is thinking out loud. And the rhetorical question, "how shall I say?" creates realism. Too easily impressed. She liked whatever she looked on, and her looks went everywhere. So she likes everything she sees. Everything is a source of delight for her. And now we might understand the Duke's perspective here and say that this is evidence of her being flirtatious, that this is evidence of her being somehow slightly wild in her manner. But the fact that her looks went everywhere really reveals the Duke's suspicious nature. Her looks went everywhere. Every time she looks at something, this is cause for him to become jealous. This is the root of the Duke's jealousy. He is controlling enough that he wants to control what she looks at. Her looks went everywhere. He imagines that everything pleases her more than him. Sir, 'twas all one. So in the Duchess's eyes, what this exclamative remark suggests is that everything she sees delights her equally, and this enrages him. So the use of that short exclamative reveals his frustration at how pleased she is by everything. This word one creates a sense of equivalence, creates a sense of sameness. The way she sees things, everything pleases her equally. And he feels that he should be at the top of the hierarchy in the ways that she sees the world. He's a duke, he's powerful. As he goes on to argue, he has a 900 years old name. He's used to people bowing and scraping to him and not even daring to question him. So the fact that she doesn't look up to him and almost treat him in a worshipful way is what creates his sense of rage. So the word one creates a sense of equivalence, meaning sameness. The Duke is enraged that he is not a priority for her in comparison to everything else that she sees. And then we have this list here. And the list is of all of these things that in his view she sees as equal. My favour at her breast, meaning my attentions, my affection, the dropping of the daylight in the west. She sees it as equivalent to a sunset. And we really are reminded there that this is presumably quite a young woman that he's speaking about. There's a real sense of innocence when we hear the other things that she loves as much as she loves him. The bough of cherries some officious fool broke in the orchard for her, and the white mule that she rides. So the list reminds us of the Duchess's youth and her innocence, because these are the things that she loves: her mule and sunsets and cherries. These don't necessarily reflect the interests or the passions of an older, more mature woman. They seem like the passions of a young girl. And while we get that sense of her youth and innocence, we also get that sense of her naivety. The fact that she sees all of these things as somehow the same and perhaps doesn't realise the way that this is enraging her husband. Okay, so moving on, and we'll move quite quickly through this second half. So the white mule she rode with around the terrace, all and each would draw from her alike the approving speech. So here again we have this language creating that sense of equivalence, language clarifying that she sees all of these things as essentially the same. They all bring her a similar amount of joy. All would draw alike from her the approving speech, or blush at least. And there again is that reference to her expression, the physical expression of her joy, which he seems frustrated not to be able to control. So the Duke desires control over her happiness, and this involuntary reaction frustrates him. Okay. She thanked men. Good. but thanked somehow, I know not how, as if she ranked my gift of a 900 years old name with anyone's gift. The use of these dashes here creates a sense of fragmentation. And there's that method and the effect. The dashes create a sense of fragmentation. And when we see fragmented speech, you need to be thinking about the fact that this often represents a slightly fragmented, broken up, over-emotional state of mind. I always make the comparison to Lady Macbeth's fragmented syntax, her fragmented speech in Act 5 of Macbeth, when she has descended into madness and is frantically washing her hands over and over. The fragmented speech comes to reflect and symbolise her fragmented state of mind, her descent. So here, the dashes create a sense of fragmentation, and this emphasises the Duke's growing anger. As he relives the decision to have his wife killed. We're not quite there yet, but this is what we're building up to. She thanked men somehow, I know not how, as if she ranked my gift of a 900 years old name with anybody's gift. And here we finally understand the real root of his aggravation, the real root of his sense of being treated in a humiliating way. My gift of a 900 years old name, this is the gift that he believes he has given her in marrying her. He's allowed her to marry into his family and to receive this part in his legacy. My gift of a 900 years old name. So the 900 years old name reflects his authority and status. And this is what he feels she does not respect. She does not respect his status or his authority. And he refers to the marriage as a gift. He feels that she lacks gratitude. She should be happier to be with him, and she should be more demonstrative. She needs to show that happiness more clearly. As if she ranked my gift with anybody's gift. So what aggravates him is the fact that in her eyes, he thinks, she sees this as a gift on par with the cherries that she was given or the mule that she likes to ride around. Who'd stoop to blame this sort of trifling? And here he's asking, who would even bother to criticise something so ridiculous? Who would even have the patience to bring something like this up? And the question here, I think that he is asking, this question serves to represent the Duke almost seeking agreement from the messenger, as if to say, don't you think that this behaviour is an absurdity? Don't you agree with me that this behaviour is unacceptable? So that question serves to reflect his desire to have his view agreed with. Even had you skill in speech, which I have not, and just look at the fragmentation here continuing, these little asides in parentheses, the comments that he's saying that you might make, and again all the way through these dashes, emphasising that frustration, that anger, as if he can't control the way that he's speaking anymore. Compare that to the beginning of the poem, in which he speaks with absolutely beautiful control. We have the use of caesura here in the middle of the lines, and we have a lot more of a sense that he's speaking in a measured, controlled way. By the end of the poem, this is breaking down as we build up to the moment of the moment when he gave commands to have her killed. Even had you skill in speech, which I have not, to make your will quite clear to such a one, and say, just this or that in you disgusts me. So even if you were able to say, even if you were able to talk your ideas through and explain how this woman's behaviour was repulsive, he goes on to say that this would be some stooping, that this would be to lower himself and to degrade himself, to even have to explain to her how her behaviour is repulsive. And this word disgusts is incredibly powerful. This reveals, and I think for the first time, how clearly it reveals the depth of his anger. He's disgusted by her. Here you miss or there exceed the mark means here you don't perhaps show enough attention. Here you go too far. To exceed the mark is to go too far. And if she let herself be lessoned so, if she allowed herself to be taught, here we get the sense of that power dynamic between the two of them. He believes that she should be taught, that this is her failing and her lack of understanding. If she let herself be lessoned so if she were to allow herself to be taught how to behave, nor plainly set her wits to yours, forsooth, and made excuse, and if she didn't try and argue, if she just accepted it, even then would be some stooping, and I choose never to stoop. This would be one of those lines that I would really recommend you learn and think about how you would write about this in an exam. I choose never to stoop. So this, first of all, explains to us his decision. For him, stooping means to lower oneself. He feels that to explain himself to her is degrading and unnecessary. We get the sense that this is someone who comes from such extraordinary privilege that people simply know how to behave around him, that he's always been treated with respect, that he's always been treated almost worshipfully, reverentially, that he's been looked up to and bowed and scraped before, and he cannot fathom the fact that this young woman doesn't seem to know how he expects to be treated. And we might imagine that this is her ignorance, we might imagine that she's foolish, but again, I think that this really helps us to understand her youth, her innocence, and her naivety, the fact that she has not managed to meet his expectations, and the fact that she doesn't realise that this is putting her in a dangerous position. So I choose never to stoop. So at this point, there is no going back for him. I choose never to stoop reveals the Duke's arrogance, but also his determination that he will never be put in this situation. He feels humiliated by her behaviour and he cannot accept it. He chooses never to lower himself. "Oh, sir," again speaking to the messenger, "she smiled, no doubt, whene'er I passed her. So certainly she smiled at me, but who passed without much the same smile? So he demands to be treated as different and as better than others. Demands to be treated as superior." This grew. And the word "this" is ambiguous here. It could be referring to his anger, but it could also be referring to her behaviour. This grew. So the word "this" is ambiguous. It could have two meanings. It could refer to his anger, and it could also refer to her behaviour. So it can either mean that her behaviour is increasingly flirtatious, but it could also mean that his frustration, his anger, his jealousy, his sense of humiliation and degradation, it could also suggest that that is building up as well. I gave commands. So these are the commands to have his wife killed. And for a really short line, this is fantastically powerful. I gave commands. This is a man with such power and authority and such an ability to abuse his power. He doesn't have to lower himself. He doesn't have to stoop to kill his wife himself. He can simply order somebody else to do it. And it's as simple as any other task. He tells someone to do this and it is done. This grew. I gave commands. Then all smiles stopped together. And then we have that caesura there. And that caesura creates an absolute sense of finality. And it is completely final. This is the moment at which the Duchess has been killed. All smiles stop together is really interesting. And again, it's slightly ambiguous. All smiles could refer to all of her smiles, all of the Duchess's smiles, not only to the Duke but to other people that she happens to pass. But it could also reflect the ceasing of smiles of other people, the people who would have known her, the people who would have liked her. It could mean that there is a sense of a complete ending of this joy. Okay. And he points back towards the portrait in this next line. There she stands, as if alive. And that reflects and it echoes the line right here at the beginning, as if she were alive. And we get the impression that actually it is as good as if she were alive. He is as happy to look at this portrait as he was to look at her, because the portrait is equally beautiful, but it's also something that he can control. There she stands, as if alive. So it echoes the opening of the poem. And it creates that sense that she is as good as alive in his eyes. This is something he can control. He speaks again to the messenger. Will it please you rise? Inviting the messenger to get up. We'll meet the company below, then. And this is where we start to understand who exactly this messenger is. We start to understand that the messenger is here on behalf of the Count, your master, and he has come to help negotiate the dowry. The Duke says, I repeat, the Count, your master's known munificence is ample warrant that no just pretence of mine for dowry will be disallowed. So the messenger's Count, the messenger's master, is known for his generosity. So the Duke expects to be paid handsomely for his decision to marry this next young wife, this next young woman. He expects that no just pretence of mine for dowry will be disallowed. He'll be paid well. The dowry was the sum of money that was paid by the family, by particularly the father of the soon-to-be bride, paid to the groom in order to sort of transfer this piece of property, the woman. So it was a sum of money that was paid to the soon-to-be groom, which symbolised the passing over of power, which symbolised the transference of the woman as property from her father's family to her husband. So the Duke expects to be paid well for his next marriage. However, he quite quickly makes it clear that his reasons for wanting to marry this young woman are not strictly financial. He says, though his fair daughter's self, as I avowed at starting, is my object. So he says it isn't about the dowry. It's related to his new bride's beauty, the fact that she is fair. And this word object means this was his goal, his fair daughter's self. He wants to possess her. And when we look at that line in isolation, it might sound romantic, but when we take it in the wider context of everything that we've just read, we have to find it really disturbing and we have to find it troubling. His fair daughter's self, as I avowed at starting, is my object. So, he claims he wants to marry her essentially for love, for non-financial reasons. However, Browning leaves the poem with a note that again just reminds us of the Duke's true character. He continues, nay, we'll go together down, sir. But just as they're about to leave the chamber, notice Neptune, though, taming a seahorse, thought a rarity, which Claus of Innsbruck cast in bronze for me. So on the way out, the Duke points at another work of art. And this time it's a statue which he owns. Now, as I said at the beginning, in real life the Duke of Ferrara was known for being a patron of the arts. He was known for being an art lover. So on one level, this is Browning demonstrating his knowledge of history and writing a character that's in keeping with known historical facts. However, in the context of the poem as a whole, we have to identify the fact that he's here pointing out this sculpture, this statue, immediately after having been talking about his late wife's portrait. And this creates a sense of equivalence between these two things. He looks at the portrait of his late wife the same way that he looks at any other work of art. It's simply another possession, another item within his collection. And it's a particularly precious one because it was thought a rarity. So he admires this work because it is something that he can own, and just like the wife that he is about to marry, just like his late Duchess, he enjoys owning and possessing things. So this creates a sense of equivalence. With the portrait of the last Duchess. And it's really no coincidence that the work of art in question is Neptune, the god of the sea, taming a seahorse. So the sculpture itself, this statue, symbolises a god taming a wild animal. Sorry, the statue doesn't symbolise it. The statue depicts it, it shows it. And this comes to symbolise, or this could be seen to symbolise, the Duke's perception of himself. He is the godlike figure. His last Duchess was tamed by him. And tamed by him in a particularly cruel way. The way that he tamed her was to have her killed, but in doing so he exerted his final control over her. We get the impression from these last few lines that again, any future bride, the young girl that he is about to marry, will be expected to submit to his authority in the same way that the seahorse submits to Neptune's, and will be expected to look up to him as he sees himself, like a god. All right, a long poem this one, but a fantastic story, and I hope that you've enjoyed looking through it again. Let me know if there's anything that you would like me to cover in the next couple of videos, and again, thank you for sticking with us. Thanks for revising.